Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Ben Newton. And from going forward, any problems with the presentation or the quality of the presenter will be blamed on the cable. Just make sure when you rate me. No, I'm just kidding. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it. I'm sorry for the delay. So I've been with Sumo Logic for about 4.5 years. And I focus at Sumo Logic on analytics. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how you can take advantage of analytics. We'll go through it a little bit. Whoa, there we go. We'll go through the how you can apply analytics based on the kind of applications you're building. I'll try to use the time wisely, and if we don't get to questions, you can feel free to come up to me afterwards. So let's get started. So what we're going to talk about is really three things. I want to set some context about what's going on, and I don't think this will be new to most of you, but what's going on with applications today, and then what does that mean to analytics, and then what does that mean to you as you're trying to use analytics. So to set that in context, I want to start with a quote that pretty much I would expect all of you have heard about software eating the world from Mark Andreessen. Now, one thing you may not have seen is that even pretty traditional companies are admitting, like for example GE, who is actually really advanced pretty far in this, that the software is determining the success of their business. So I think pretty much anyone here would expect that your business is depending on software. So if we set that as a context, that software is driving business, and software is the beating heart of the modern business, what does that mean about the modern application? So first of all, what that means is that the user is king. And so I think back to when I started, it was okay to have web pages loading in 10 seconds. It was okay that things went down. Now, if the search results don't come back in a certain amount of time, if I have a transaction that fails on Amazon, what do? I go somewhere else. You lose customers just like that. So that means that you've now got to have greater uptime, you've got to have greater performance, you've got to have greater usability than you ever had to do before. Now, the other part of that is the scale. So I worked as a contractor for the Army for a while, running their mail system. And I remember when we were super, super proud of having 1 million email users. Now that's small peanuts. The scale of the number of users that are using your service is unprecedented. So if you think about the demands on the quality of the software changing and the scale is changing, then how do we respond to that? So the first way we responded is building our applications differently. So I think most of the picture on the left is probably familiar to a lot of you. Some of our younger engineers at Sumo Logic don't even remember when it was like this, but this is what I used to work on. It was 3-tier applications with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of servers with giant Oracle databases on the back end. You wanted to scale that thing, what did you do? You had to buy more hardware. You had to pay Oracle a big license cost to get more space on your Oracle server, and that's how you scaled it. Now, if you are moving to the new kind of modern application, we've now taken that complexity that was kind of buried in these big iron servers, and we've broken that out. We've decomposed it. So now we can separately scale each one of those components. So for example, Sumo Logic, this is what we do. We've decomposed every part of our service into small components or services that we can scale independently. And why do you do that? You do that so that it's more resilient, so it has better performance and it runs faster. So this is the kind of application that I would expect most of you guys are either building or want to build or on the way to build, right? So what does that also mean for the way we're thinking about deploying applications? So particularly what we're talking about here at swampUP, what kind of technology are we using to drive that? So again, when I was starting out, we moved from bare metal servers to virtual machines. That was the big thing. VMware was driving a lot of innovation there. We were super excited about it. Now, container technology wasn't new. I remember I almost went to work for a company called RPath that had containerized technology, but people didn't want to buy it at that point in time. Why? Because it wasn't the right time. But now with that architecture we were just looking at, now containers came at the perfect time so that we can use that technology to scale rapidly. Now, you may not use exactly that exact architecture, but the technologies would be familiar to you. So we're building our applications differently. We're deploying and managing them. Our deployment pipeline is so different. And part of that, if you guys have heard of Conway's Law, well, what happens with Conway's Law? Well, your architecture reflects in your organization and vice versa. So our teams are working differently. So when I was starting out, we had the web, app, and database teams didn't talk to each other. The Linux and Windows guys didn't talk to each other. set of different tables, maybe not even in the same building. And so what's happening now is that you have, from code to production, developers owning it end-to-end, maybe with some SRE help, but these are cross-functional teams that are owning it end-to-end. And so, I mean, this was exemplified for me when I was talking to one of the people on one of my teams, and he did not understand the idea that a developer didn't have to have a pager. I was a developer when you didn't have to have a pager, and I didn't have to work on the weekends. So, I mean, it's completely changed basically the connection of development engineering teams to what they're building. So when we get to what Sumo Logic does, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but when we're really thinking about analytics and the uptime and performance of your application, that has changed a lot too. When I was starting out, it was all about the connection between the servers and maybe some of the complexity inside the servers. And you were really worried about, is the database connection bad? Is, the connection to the internet bad? Now, when you look at that same kind of service in microservices, it is so much more complex, right? You see, you may have a hard time seeing the red from the back there, but that simple transaction is now a hugely complicated system. So what this means is that managing the performance of that application is significantly more complicated. So now you have to figure out, when somebody comes in the front, what are all the different points that are being touched? And when you're seeing a user problem, how do you trace that to the actual problem? Now, one of the things I find really interesting to this that's developed recently is, I mean, everybody knows who Gartner is, and usually Gartner is talking about things about 1.5 years, 2 years after they've happened. They're usually not on the forefront of these kind of trends of the cutting edge, but if you look at the way they were thinking about this now, they are saying that the current tool sets that are out there for you to use, APM being one of those, but a lot of the current tool sets that are out there can't keep up with that architecture. They can't keep up with the rate of change. They can't keep up with the amount of data that's being produced. They can't give you visibility. So this is kind of the situation that you're stuck with. And again, at Sumo Logic, we have the same problem. So another way to look at it is you really have, on one side, you have the scale going up and to the right. Call it users, call it number of instances, whatever it is. And you have the size of the components is going down to the right. So microservices is just a step on that. Maybe the next thing is serverless functions, maybe it's something else. But it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's basically this intersection point that generates an immense amount of complexity. And in a lot of ways, I think that is the problem that the analytics of the next decade has to solve. And that really you have to solve is running applications. So if we start with that context, then what does that mean when you actually have to solve that with analytics? So there's a couple of things to think about. So I'm going to give some high-level principles that I found important with my customers, and then we can talk a little bit about some specifics about how you might actually do that. So one of the things is that your application is unique. So again, thinking back to the 3-tier applications, you could walk from one 3-tier application to another, and you could probably figure it out. Oh, these guys are using WebLogic, these guys are using WebSphere, these guys are using Oracle, whatever. And you could figure out the general idea of what's going on. Well, the reality is, and as we're pushing toward microservices, maybe the underlying core architecture is the same, but the applications could be immensely different. So for example, at Sumo Logic, we do search queries. We do allowing our users to get into their data and run queries against that data. Nobody else can tell us exactly how to measure the performance of that. We have to figure it out on our own. We have to figure out the right way to measure that for our customers. Other tools can't tell us how to do that. So that's an important difference that has changed in the last few years. Another part of that is that a lot of the tools are designed for the last architecture. So what I mean by that is that you might have tools that are designed to run when software was running on premise, or when it was running on bare metal servers and servers actually mattered. Servers don't necessarily matter as much anymore. But if your tool thinks they matter, then suddenly they matter. But the reality is you're building that. Does your tool actually understand that? And I think it's very hard to change a tool architecture after the fact. So we're seeing it even with beyond analytics. Are your tools actually designed for the problem you're trying to solve? Now, another piece of that is data silos. So if you think back to the way that we were talking about the teaming structure, as things were kind of run with a monolithic app, you had a web team, an app team, a database team, a server team, the network team. Each one of those teams would have their own tool sets to manage their performance. It was totally normal because they were kind of running as a silo. Where the reality is, if you have that cross-functional team that we were showing before, that whole team needs to have visibility across the service that they're running. They can't afford to have 3 or 4 different tools that they're running to achieve that. And if you do, that's going to slow you down, which is going to make, basically impact your customers because you have more downtime, right? Which is the whole problem. Secondly is, as you're running in the cloud, is your tool running in the cloud with you? So what we're finding is that as customers are moving, as the people we talk to are moving their applications to the cloud, they're also increasingly preferring stuff that they can either run in the cloud or is cloud native, right? So there's now a preponderance for wanting your analytics tools to run there. Because if your analytics tools, again, were designed for the last generation, then how would you expect them to work with the kind of stuff that you're building? And bottom line, what's the problem that we're getting at? And this is really where it fundamentally comes down to. You can't fix what you can't see. So if you don't have visibility into what's going on in your application because either the tools don't work for you or you haven't instrumented it, how do you expect to fix it? Because at 2 a.m. when it's broken, that's not the time to go back and put the instrumentation that you forgot to put in, right? So this is the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve. Now, what we found with a lot of our customers when they talk to us is that they have a lot of different tools that they're trying to manage this, right? So, it's not uncommon for me to talk to someone who has 4, 5, 6 different tools that are trying to do the same thing. So, I mean, how do you expect to be highly efficient and be able to solve these problems in a reasonable way if you have all these different tools that are overlapping and conflicting with each other? So you really got the situation where things are changing and your analytics tools aren't necessarily to keep up with that. So how do you want to solve that problem? So one way to think about it, and the way I usually like to talk about it, is think about it in terms of use cases. So one way that we've started talking about it, we've been talking about this for a few years now, is how you actually run your application. So what matters is how you actually day-to-day interact with your own application performance. So one way to think about that is, how do you build your application? So how do your developers actually build and run that application? How do they then get it to production and run that application? And then how to secure it. And as you guys have probably seen, we're even hearing terms like DevSecOps now and things like that, where it is basically encompassing this entire end-to-end lifecycle. And the reality is now that your developers are owning the operational maintenance, or at least heavily involved in that, you have to have visibility into all of that. So if we kind of start with on the build side, which would kind of make sense in terms of like where you would start, what I found interesting here is that if we think about how we've done this at Blade, at Sumo Logic, and we think about how some of our customers have done it, what they've told us is that this really starts at the moment you write code. So what I mean by that is, if you aren't thinking about instrumenting and measuring and doing analytics on your app when you're writing the code, how do you expect it to work well in production? So for example, we were talking to one of our customers just a few days ago that I think had a really good example where they were actually, their architects, as part of their, what I would probably call a GA checklist, so a go live checklist, would say, have you instrumented things in this certain way? Can you measure the performance of your app? Can you measure the latency of your app? Do you have the right logs? Do you have the right performance metrics? Have you measured all those things, and can we show that in your test environment? If you don't do that early on, then how do you expect to be able to do that later, right? So that means that you have to be able to measure it when you're building, and that's where a lot of what we're talking about here. When you're running the tests, so for example, at Sumo, we have one of our engineers runs, actually does performance metrics on Jenkins as they're running these tests. And then when you get to the deploy as well, so as you're deploying those environments, do you have visibility into how those deployments are going, when the deployments are happening, and how that's affecting your infrastructure? Now, if you switch gears a little bit and think about how this works when you're running your application, so what are you worried about then? So one of the things I like to think about in 3 general areas, and hopefully this makes sense. So one is, I think these terms should be, familiar to everybody. So one is monitoring. So how do you know that a problem has happened, and how do you respond to that? How do you identify and detect problems? Now, once you've identified and detected those problems, how do you then go and uncover what the root cause is? How do you get your service back up again? How do you, reduce downtime? Now, one of the things I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, that I think is often forgotten is the optimize step. So once the fire's out, things are running hopefully well, how do you think about how you can make it better next time? How do you understand your application to be able to improve it over time? Now, when we think about this, there's not necessarily, like we had on the last slide, tools that fit neatly into this. So one way to think about this is full stack visibility. So, just like I was saying, if it's 2 a.m. and you forgot the instrument part of your stack, it's too late. So you really have to think about this end to end. And the great thing about microservices and having more of a DevOps approach is that your developers are heavily involved in all of this. So our developers, for example, are understand every bit of that stack, and they know how to instrument it. So now you're thinking about, okay, with my core infrastructure, do I know if it's running hot? These are all the things that are pretty normal for everybody to think about. But also, on your application code, am I able to measure things like latency? Am I able to see exceptions, stack traces? Now, where it's often forgotten is when you get to the far right. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting things are happening now, because how do you know what's going on with your users in your application? So just telling me that you're running at 90% CPU is useless unless you can tie that to your customers, if you can tie that to your users. How do you do that? Do you know how to measure that? So for example, I was just having a discussion on a call with one of my engineering teams this morning, is how are we going to measure the adoption of a new product that we're putting out? How are we going to measure how users are using it? And you have to think about that up front. So if you think about that and you've got that end-to-end data, another lens on that is going to be the people that are going to be thinking about that data. So if we think about, and I think this again is something that has changed significantly just in the last few years. So again, when I was starting out in the early 2000s, the only people that cared about data like this were ops people. They had the big boards with lots of red lights. Nobody else cared about that. Then you saw support teams caring more about it. When there was a problem, they were the ones having to explain this to users. Now what you're finding is that it's moving to people that are not directly involved in the day-to-day operations. So for example, monitoring, obviously it's the people that run the application, your engineering teams. But as you get through troubleshooting to optimize, then people like me care about the data. So, for example, I was on the phone with somebody from one of our customers just a couple days ago, and they were asking, how do I, as a product manager, use this data to understand my customers? Now, I think just a few years ago, that would have seemed, for a lot of companies, like a strange question to ask. Why aren't they using, some other tool that has nothing to do with these kind of the data that we're looking at? Now they care. I absolutely care about the latency on my app. I absolutely care about adoption. And now you have salespeople. So for example, at Sumo Logic, our salespeople use the data from our own application. So they have dashboards that they look at that tell them what their customers are doing. Are they adopting the application? Are they running into problems? Is there a reason we should talk to them sooner rather than later? Our customer success uses our data to run health reports, right? And I think that the more comprehensive data you have, the more you're going to be able to enable that. So if we think about that, we're instrumenting our application from the very beginning, and we're making that part of our requirements process, from my product management perspective. We're including that early on. We're making sure that we have that full stack visibility with all this different type of data. And we're thinking about the different people that are going to use that, because again, the more valuable you make the data, the more valuable it is to your end customers. Then how do you think about some of the, how that data would be used, and how do you think about how you build that data? So this is something that we've talked about a few times before, about some of the things you would really want to think about as you're building out this data. So first of all, on the monitoring, is thinking about what's important to your business. So I think this is something, there's a really great book out there called Art of Monitoring, which I suggest everybody read, by Turnbull. And one of the things he says, which I very much buy into, is that in the past, what did you measure? You are always measuring and alerting on the infrastructure metrics. So the things that were easy to understand, so like CPU, memory, latency, things like that. Do your customers care about that? No. So if you're measuring yourself as a business on something else, then why are you alerting on those things that don't directly affect your end customers? So for example, with Sumo Logic, we care about query latency. You would expect that, right? We care about query performance because people are going into our tool and they're writing queries, and if it's twice as slow, they notice that. So we have a custom metric that we built that tells us about search performance. And we alert on that. So if we see a certain percentage of our customers, or certain percentage of users that are having query performance problems, that is going to wake somebody up at 2 a.m. And that is much better to be waking up at 2 a.m. because the customer is being affected, or because the data is coming in slower, than the fact that the server is running hot. Well, that doesn't matter. I can go back to bed now. So it's all about measuring things that matter, and measuring those user visible metrics, which allows you to have more impactful monitoring, right? Now, once you get to the troubleshooting step, That's not good enough anymore, right? So now you're moving beyond what's happening to your users. Are you measuring the data that's going to allow you to understand what's going on? So all that other data that you're measuring in the system, like latency, CPU, memory, exceptions, all these different type of data you can pull in that we were looking at, it's very important for that to be comprehensive, because again, when it's 2 a.m. and you're woken up and your business KPIs are telling you that something's wrong, now you need to open up the kimono and really understand everything that's going on. And you need to have all that data at your fingertips. So it's kind of that balance between the business KPIs and then the comprehensive. And one of those parts that we're finding is really important as well is being able to correlate. So what I mean by that is, now I want to know that when I had a business KPI over here, like search performance for us, well, that might be tied and correlated with the fact that I'm having a high CPU load, which is tied to the fact that I had an out-of-memory error, which is in the log. So being able to draw that line in the context of that modern application, that microservices that we saw, that's what you really want to get to, right? And to do that, you have to have all that data in that comprehensive look. And finally, on the optimized side, just like you say, you can't fix what you can't measure, you can't improve it. So this is something that, particularly as a product manager, I struggle with, is that if I can't see what my users are doing, I don't know if they're actually getting value out of the things I'm building, right? So again, you have to have the right metrics in there that are telling you those things. Now, one piece that we're finding is becoming more important is how metadata approaches with that. So here's what I mean by that. So for example, when your engineering and ops teams are over here and they're looking at uptime, what do they care about? They care about systems and applications. They care about components. Which clusters are going bad? Which servers are going bad? What components? What part of my code? When you're over on this side, now you care more about the business and maybe what customers, maybe what organizations, what users. Not that you don't necessarily care about it over here, but that's much more important over there. What is that? It's just metadata, right? So having the right metadata, again, built in from the beginning is how you can actually gain value as you move to the right. So again, that's why it's so important, if we go back to that build stage, that you can do this in your testing and your build cycle. So if you can't say your fake customers, what's going on with your fake customers in testing, how are you going to do that in production? And that's all driven by metadata. Now another part is also the real time. So one thing I've seen is that there's a tendency on the optimized stage to say, oh, it's totally fine if it's a day late. But I would expect that most of you that are running applications, if you're a day late in fixing something that's affecting your users, you're about 23 hours and 30 minutes too late, right? You have to have real-time visibility into that. So I think what we're at least finding for our own business is we want to see when there's things that we can improve and take care of as soon as they happen. So real-time really matters. Okay, so we've kind of taken this overview of everything you can do with analytics and how that really applies back to the modern application. So let's talk a little bit about specifically, why we're here with JFrog, about how that would tie into a specific use case. I'm going to show you some dashboards. You can actually go out to our booth if you want to see some more specifics on some other things we can do. So let's talk a little bit about that. So again, having visibility into every part of your pipeline, one of the ways you can do is have that into your build pipeline, into your continuous delivery. So we have the ability to, with JFrog, to pull data out of Artifactory and show that in real-time dashboards. And so one of the wonderful things about that is really has a broad application. It's not just an understanding exactly how my deployment process is going, but number one, for example, up top, I can see geolocation. Why does that matter? Well, if somebody is interacting with my build pipeline, with my code in some place that I don't expect, that's really bad. I want to perhaps deal with that. For example, we just did an agreement with another one of our partners to do threat intelligence. So for example, if I know that it's a bad actor that is interacting with my code, that's even worse. So again, that geographic visibility. And now I can also see these kind of overview of things that are going, like who's downloading, where is it coming from, who's interacting with my data in specifics. Now, you can drill down into that and you can get more details. And so these are dashboards that you can go in, and we have a lot of out-of-the-box content that we provide, and then you can go in and edit these and create them and make them your own. So for example, here, I can see this is what we call outlier detection. So for example, I can look at the particular type of activity. In this case, it's deploys, it could be downloads, it could be something else, latency, whatever else you're using in the product. But I can see right there, and you can see that little red triangle, is telling me that it's acting differently than normal. So again, when you're looking at the activity of any part of your pipeline, the only thing that matters is this normal or not? So being able to detect that is incredibly important. And finally, you're going to be, another way of looking at this is, for example, denied deployments. And so this is another part of the application. So I can look again, outliers in terms of where people have tried and been denied to pull that down. So all this information is incredibly important for me to understand both the security, the performance, and the uptime of my entire pipeline. Now, what you can see is, just for sake of time, we won't show any more today, but you can see it in the booth. We have, a significant number of ways for you to get that kind of visibility into all those different things I was showing early in the slides, like showing visibility into other parts of your deployment process, into the architecture you're using, into your cloud environment, into your AWS environment, and giving you that kind of visibility. All right, so I think that's everything. So I wanted to leave a couple minutes. I think we're doing actually pretty good on time. So if there's we can take a couple questions. You can always come up later if there's anything that's, and I appreciate everybody being patient in the beginning with the technical problems. Again, is there anything you didn't like about the presentation? It's the fault of the cord. Okay, good. Any questions? All right, so this is so obvious that everyone just got it. Okay, good. I think you got it. I can see that. All right, any questions? Okay, well, go ahead.
Just a quick question. How do you see this applying to actual user experience when a user is, say, navigating through a web application, collecting number of clicks, the round trips that you make to either a microservice or even serverless functions, for example, and the data you collect based on a particular thumbprint or footprint that a user creates on a web application? How do you see that improving the user experience as such?
Oh, so let me make sure that I understand the question. So how do I see measuring the user experience to be able to improve the user experience, and how we would do that?
How do you enhance that?
How do we handle that?
Data, yeah. How do you enhance that?
Oh, how do we enhance that? Okay. That's a great question. So I think part of that is, for one, I think having the depth of data is really important. So for example, only understanding the very top level of what's happening with that user, for example, knowing that their query ran slowly is one thing. So for example, if I just talk specifically about Sumo, we can detect if their query ran slowly with a custom metric we created, but we can also see what type of query they ran. We can see what type of data it ran against. We can see exactly what data it accessed, what server that was on. So basically, for example, if we have a customer having a poor experience, then one of our engineers, they're a lot smarter than me, can go in and they can draw that line and say, oh, well, this is happening because we have something in our indexing code that isn't working right. Or we can see that, for example, one of our streaming nodes isn't working correctly. So I think part of that is it's not just tying to user experience. Like, for example, in my last job, we talked a lot about just pure user experience. But the problem is if you can't connect that to what's going on in your application, then how do you ever expect to improve that? And I think another side of that is also we try to have good partnerships around this. So for example, we have a partnership with New Relic, and there's other customers we work with where we can exchange data. And so you can take some of that amazing visibility that New Relic can provide and then tie that again with the deep visibility. And I think that's the key. It's that end-to-end, top-to-bottom visibility that really makes all the difference. And I think in the past with some of the monolithic applications, you could get away without that because they were pretty standard architectures. But the reality is if you build it and it's all custom, I mean, what I tell a lot of customers is nobody can tell me how to run Sumo Logic right. Our engineers know how to do that. So we have to build our own metrics. So even when you're talking about that user experience metric, we have to build that. And then we actually involve our user experience people in building that. So again, on this call I was talking about this morning, to make it specific, our user experience designer is designing the KPIs, which our engineers will then build, which will then be monitored, right? So I think it's about all having that kind of comprehensive team-based approach. I mean, is that answering the question?
Yeah, it does, definitely. Thank you.
That's a great question. Anybody else? They liked it. All right, well, feel free to come up to any of us later. We've, one of my colleagues, Sebastian here, who knows a lot about the particular Artifactory integration. Happy to talk to you guys. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.